So let's talk about Reimer. Um, it just doesn't get any clearer than my thesis is, and I still think it's just so funny that I talked last week about how you rarely get that, and then we have two good examples this week, especially the Dalton Reimer article, Phases in Problem Solving. Um, Here's one of the things I really appreciated about Reimer, who's a professor, as you know, I'm sure, a professor of communications at a Mennonite university in California, in Fresno. It's a nice application, and this is the kind of stuff I really like for this course. Are places where we can see applications or integration of biblical ideas, biblical scriptures, biblical what's the word? Themes into our everyday life, into our work lives. And I think he does a really nice job of introducing a biblical text into a specific problem, the problem of problem solving. And so that I think he's to be commended for that. So a strength and a weakness, kind of the same thing that I did just with the Scheffler article and then last week as well. I think one of the things I really appreciate about what Reimer does here, and this is to be expected, I think, from a communication professor, is that he plots the issue of problem solving within the larger culture. It's not just a biblical problem, it's not just a communications problem, it's not just a nursing problem, it's a problem for humankind. And he says, well, here's a way in which these biblical guys, and as Christians, he's writing to other Christians that may not be where we all are in terms of our faith expression, but he's writing to Christians, and he says, maybe when it comes to decision making and problem solving, we ought to look at what's going on in where we have examples of that in the Bible, and certainly Acts 15 is one that meets that requirement for him. So that I think that's really helpful as a biblical scholar. I like to say that the Bible actually does have application to the real life lived situations in which we find ourselves. Here's a weakness that I think that I felt. He talks about this fulcrum of the narrative, or the fulcrum as the narrative, when he's into the weeds of the chiastic structure. But I don't know that he does a really great job of saying why that's narrative and then the surrounding that is also narrative isn't the narrative he's talking about. So I don't know that he builds enough fences to make that totally clear. I know what he's getting at because I'm an insider, and he's writing to insiders. But there's a side of me that says, well, I think maybe he could have explained that a little bit more, and why this narrative, that is the narrative of St. Peter and the narrative of St. Paul and their testimony. See, I think I would have preferred the word testimony there than the word narrative, because I think that would have bracketed their words off in a way that would have been more helpful. Perhaps I'm nitpicking, but the point is to communicate effectively. And so this is something that I think it kind of muddies the waters a little bit. Maybe you felt that way, maybe you didn't, and now you say, well, wow, I'm listening to Ragsdale, maybe that is right. Maybe that is a valid weakness, or a valid proposal for a weakness of the article. When it comes to the critique itself, the chiastic structure in Acts 15 is there. It makes sense to explain that and how he's using that with problem solving. The focus on the structure obscures the argument just a bit, and that I think may be because he may not spend as much time in biblical studies being a professor of communications. So for us, we may just kind of be able to nail that one a little bit more clearly because it's our language. But you run the risk of leaving things out. So be that as it may. I think the essential argument for peaceful decision making or peaceful problem solving is a valid one. I think that is something that is helpful for me. Now, translated outside of a religious context, there would be a recognition of some issue that motivates the need for a decision, and this is what he's doing with his argument. I think that's good. Thus, someone has to begin the conversation, and good leadership would do that, and we see that here in Acts 15. And so his next point has to do with this kind of exploration. Well, research has to be done. I think these are all good steps. And that involves to listening. And here's where I thought he was particularly helpful. Those narratives or that testimony, that provides feedback, and that is essential for good problem solving. Understanding what the issue is and how people regard the issue and what they think should be done about it. That listening piece is super important, and I don't think we do that well enough or often enough. Again, those impacted by the decision should have a say in the decision. Again, I think I've mentioned this. My wife tells me stories about decision making that happens sometimes where she has worked in the past, and how those that are not impacted by the decision, or those who are impacted by the decision, are not consulted, or they're consulted, not listened to, right? And that happens in every field. But the way she tells it to me about nursing, because it's not my field and it's foreign to me, it's funny, the stories that she tells me. And you might think, well, you say it's funny, you're not living in my shoes. That's true. It's a valid critique, but it's those things that prove the point. We must listen to each other because we're going to be better in the long run. And then the way Reimer plots out the resolution as in Acts 15. Okay, here's the decision. It seems good to all of us and to the Holy Spirit. Maybe that's just adding God on top of it. Not trying to do that. But, they've done their diligence. They have researched. They have listened. They have weighed. And a decision is made. And the leader of the church community, it's pretty clear in the New Testament that St. Peter is like the mouthpiece. He's the vocal one for the early church, the earliest church in the book of Acts. But that James has some other kind of leadership, stability granting gift that he brings to the table. By the way, this is not James, most probably is not James, the brother of John, but James, the half-brother of Jesus, who is responsible in one way, shape, or form for the book of James. So those are some thoughts about how Reimer and Scheffler, Acts 2, 8 through 11, Acts 15, provisions 5 and 6 kind of flow together this week. Hope they're helpful for you, and I'll be back with you next week.